Good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
That's much better.
I've been here before, Ray. I know the drill.
You know the drill, that's right. So, my name is Ray Andrade. I am LMU's programming librarian and an LMU alumnus, a proud LMU alumnus. So, on behalf of the entire library team, I wanted to welcome everybody to tonight's event. So, for tonight's faculty pub night, we're going to feature Dr. Sina Kramer, assistant professor from the Women and Gender Studies Department here at LMU. And tonight, Dr. Kramer will discuss her recent book, Excluded Within, the Unintelligibility of Radical Political Actors. So before we begin tonight's formal program, I did want to mention a couple of things about faculty pub night. So students, as you figured it out, it's not for faculty only, okay? Also, it is not 21 and over. Yes, we have Eric, the bartender, checking IDs to make sure you're 21. Hey, Eric. But please spread the word about this event to your friends. And please follow us on social media as well. So just search at LMU Library, and you should be able to find us. So it's a casual event, so by all means, if you get hungry or thirsty at any point, please feel free to grab something to drink or eat at any time. And at the end of the event, there will be a Q&A section. So please hold those questions until the end. And lastly, I wanted to bring your attention to these small feedback forms. Normally, Chris, the dean of the library, models these forms for us. You know the drill, Chris?
I don't have one. Oh,
Fired.
but John will.
All right, so if you fill out these forms and include your email address, you will be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. Okay, might come in handy. All right, so at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Andrew Diltz, Associate Professor of Political Science, to formally introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Diltz.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and a distinct honor. I got my copy just last week. To introduce today Professor Kramer and to help begin the celebration of her new book, Excluded Within, the Unintelligibility of Radical Political Actors. But I actually want to start my introduction the way Kramer introduces us to her book, with the arresting image on the cover, the artwork by the late Noah Purifoy entitled Watts Riot, which he made in 1966. Purifoy, who worked most of his career in Los Angeles, described the August 1965 uprisings and their aftermath as the true beginning of his own career as an artist. Along with musician and artist Judson Powell, Purifoy scoured the streets of Watts in the days immediately following the riots, collecting objects they found on the streets. Purifoy led a group of artists building on sculptures and other assemblages, such as this one featured on the cover, and exhibited them at Markham Junior High School at 104th and Compton during the spring of 1966. As one retrospective of Purifoy's work would later declare, this was the very beginning of the junk Dada movement, centered for him at least around art created from the so-called found object. Now, I am not at all an art historian, nor am I a critic of any quality, but there is something I think so deeply fitting about Kramer's choice to open her work with Purifoy's assemblage, literally comprised the shards and pieces of the city, composed and arranged by Purifoy, bringing together the traces of the uprising into a constrained space, both letting these artifacts speak and speaking through them himself. They evoke forms and signs that may be familiar to us, but they do not offer themselves as intelligible. They do not, importantly, explain themselves to the viewer, nor do they offer their own interpretation. Yet they are a reconstitution of the events of August of 1965, a reclamation of the conditions that led up to those events, and a reflection on the more than 5 decades that have passed since then. In the closing pages of Excluded Within, Kramer writes that, quote, "The question of the we haunts my project. How is the we made?" she asks. Is it produced on an additive model? Is it intersectional? Is it an assemblage? Unquote. Kramer's answer in this book, both complicated and simple, both nuanced and direct, is that, quote, "We currently live under a conception of the we that is articulated through the production of various others who cannot belong to this we, and who are yet nevertheless crucial to its existence." Unquote. We live in a world that Kramer terms of what Kramer terms as constitutive exclusion, a structure and a process by which bodies, political bodies, philosophical bodies of thought in particular, that these bodies come into existence by refusing to acknowledge some other. Now, such a body distance itself, that is, we distance ourselves, from that other by rejecting, abjecting, and subjecting the other. But we do this, it does this, while always keeping that other close at hand. This is an internal exclusion, Kramer writes, and it is how the we that we have been made, and it is the we which we are has been made, and how that we has been made has almost always been produced by violence, by domination, and oppression. And in this excellent book, Kramer gives us two powerful ways to read this process. First, Kramer shows us how to read four instances of constitutive exclusion, for moments and histories in which the we is produced through such constitutions. And we find it in Greek drama, in the Antigone. We find it in post-idealist continental philosophy, in Hegel's Science of Logic, in Derrida's Glas, in Adorno's Negative Dialectics. And we find it throughout U.S. history, perhaps most dramatically, in the struggle for black equality, in figures such as Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin. And we find it in the 1992 LA riots, which reshaped this city, its population, its police, and its politics. And once you read Kramer's book, you will see constitutive exclusion everywhere. Second, Kramer shows us how to read for instances of how such exclusions within are contested. That is, Kramer does not simply diagnose how we have come to be constitutively excluded bodies that we are, but how in each of these instances, careful reading can spot models of contestation. These are struggles, Kramer shows us, not merely to be heard or seen, but to become intelligible, to become heard or seen as political contestations of exclusion within. And some of these models are better and some of them are worse. Antigone's contestation, she reminds us, ends with her death. And Rosa Parks' contestation subordinated her own activism to a respectability narrative and led most of us to forget about Claudette Colvin's contestation a year earlier. But they are models, nevertheless, from which we can learn how to fail better and reach toward different assemblages that we already are, but we fail to acknowledge. And once you read Kramer's books, you'll be able to see contestation of constitutive exclusion everywhere. You will see it in claims and actions that might otherwise seem monstrous or confusing or disorderly or contradictory, but you'll see them, and you'll begin to be able to hear them, if you're willing to, as what they might be. Political demands for inclusion, not on the given terms, but on different terms, as demands for reconstitution. And this is why I think Kramer's book couldn't be timelier. We find ourselves, yet again, in a moment when claims and contestations are being made not exactly from the margins, but in fact from the disavowed foundations of our own communities. From Black Lives Matter, from indigenous resurgent movements, from queer women of color and young people, leading movements against violence of police, against heteropatriarchy and multiracial white supremacy, against the ongoing practices of genocidal settler colonialism. And what should strike us, and what clearly strikes Kramer, are the ways that these contestations of exclusion within, these contestations of constitutive exclusion that we see today, they have a dogged refusal to succumb to strategic straightness, to respectability politics, to forsaking some part of themselves as acceptable losses in the face of retrenched and resurgent white supremacy, even if it's in the form of Trump, to against ongoing patriarchal violence, also in the form of Trump, but deeply embedded in our own cultural production through complicity with and support of abusers, or colonial extraction, in so many subtle and overt forms that are the literal conditions of possibility for us being here today on Tongva land, but also most pressingly in the continued violence, both political and financial, against Puerto Rico, made visible by natural disaster, but quickly turned into a political disaster. There is a possibility that the problematic we that presently haunts us, that we which is able only through attachment to parasitically living off the difference it demeans, that this we might be exercised and refused, that we might become the we that we already are, reconstituted through insurgent reclamation of our plurality and our multiplicity, that through the contestation of what we can see or hear or know as political struggle, that we might recognize that we are already made up of others, assembled out of shards and pieces of history, place, and time, that there is a we that can be reconstituted, and that we might be finally worthy of its name. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sina Kramer.
Thank you. Should I keep this up here? I'm so happy and grateful to be with you to talk to you today. Grateful to Ray and everyone at the library, and grateful to my colleagues and my students, those here and all those who have supported my work. I always love hearing about what my colleagues and friends are thinking about and working on, and I've always felt that the faculty pub night in particular was also a celebration of that, a sign of arrival. For a work some 10 years in the making across 3 cities and 5 jobs and 3 disciplines, I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad that you're here with me. I'm particularly grateful to Andrew for the introduction. While it's not entirely the done thing for one's partner to introduce one at a book talk, very little about our partnership has been altogether normal, so thank you. I'm proud to be his colleague and grateful for his introduction to this book, which, after all, would not have been possible without him. So I'm going to be speaking today about my book, Excluded Within, The Unintelligibility of Radical Political Actors, published just this month. It's brand new, hot off the presses, from Oxford University Press. I began it in graduate school in Chicago, but my time at LMU and in Los Angeles has marked it indelibly. I came to Los Angeles with a PhD in philosophy in hand. My first job at LMU was a part-time contract teaching in the political science department. I didn't know much about Los Angeles. I hadn't learned from the movies. And given that that spring marked the 20th anniversary of the '92 riots, I decided that that was as good a place as any to start. I remembered the riots, but as part of a knot of experiences that marked my coming into political consciousness at my family's loud and raucous breakfast table, the OJ verdict, a contentious presidential election season, a number of distinct events fused together in the reverse telescope of 20 years. So I devoured everything I could. That October, the Santa Anas knocked out our power, and by candlelight, I read the incredible collection, available right here in the library, of contemporary coverage and analysis of the riots from independent newspapers across the country, and most especially the Los Angeles Weekly. My mouth was agape at the echoes I was hearing sounded in these pages in our own time. These echoes only became louder over the intervening years in our own age of riots, and in the militant struggles against police violence. Most importantly for my purposes here today, I saw the same efforts to ensure that what was happening in the streets of Ferguson or Baltimore was rendered unintelligible as a political contestation of political conditions. I had seen something like this before. In 2003, I joined the mass marches around the world against the Iraq War in my adopted hometown of Chicago. At the end of the march, my friends and I convinced some police that had cordoned us off to let us go in search of a bathroom. When we arrived back home, we watched in horror on the local news as Chicago's largest mass arrest of over 700 people unfolded after our fellow marchers were kettled. That is, they were ordered to disperse, but they were kept from dispersing, and then they were arrested for failing to disperse. This isn't a matter of opinion. It was, in fact, the basis of Judge Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit Court ruling that mass arrest unconstitutional. A live reporter on the scene stated that he had witnessed people who had not taken part in the protest, people who had just exited a restaurant and stepped into the street, arrested and tossed into the back of a paddy wagon. The news anchor told the reporter in no uncertain terms that because police had issued an order to disperse, those arrested had failed to comply, and so they were obviously criminal. So you see how the logic works backwards here, right? Incredulous, the reporter repeated what he had just told the anchor, that he had seen people who were in no way involved with the protest arrested. The anchor asked whether the protesters had weapons, such as bats and clubs. The reporter replied they carried signs and placards. The years after September 11th provided a number of such lessons, an intense education in epistemology, or the study of knowledge. The sense of being down the rabbit hole, or being in the upside down, taught me how to read and how to question. I learned to read for what wasn't there, but was necessary to what was there, the outside, the underside, the noise, for what was hardest to see, hear, to understand, or to grasp, but which seemed necessary to those things which were clearest. I was most concerned with who usually went unheard, or who we didn't listen to or understand, whose claims are unintelligible to us, and why. And how was this unintelligibility made, constructed, or produced? These were the questions that helped me make sense of the world that I had just discovered that I lived in. that framed this project and that framed my reading of the '92 riots. So here's a little map of what's coming next to prepare you. 25 years ago, in the spring of 1992, just as LMU prepared for graduation weekend, Los Angeles erupted in flames. On April 29th, shortly after 3 p.m., a jury in the Simi Valley courtroom acquitted 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers, Stacy Kuhn, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wynn, and Theodore Briseno, of multiple charges against them, including assault with a deadly weapon and filing a false police report. A year earlier, on March 3rd, 1991, these officers made a traffic stop in the San Fernando Valley after a high-speed chase and brutally beat the suspect, Rodney King, while 17 other police officers looked on. The video captured by George Holliday, who lived near the scene of the beating, went viral, first on KTLA and then on news programs around the world. Los Angeles waited for more than a year, patiently testing the hypothesis of equal protection under the law. When the 4 officers were acquitted the following spring, the response mounted in some quarters of the city: South Central, Pico Union, Koreatown, Hollywood, parts of West Los Angeles and the San Fernando Valley, and here at Florence and Normandy, went similarly viral, having been broadcast in part live in LA and around the country. The duration of the riot is a matter of dispute. It is generally agreed that it began after the verdict was announced, but its end could be marked at May 4th, when the city curfew was lifted, or at May 8th, when the National Guard troops began to pull out, or at May 10th, when the deployment was ended and the federalization of National Guard troops was lifted. Depending on which you choose, 45 to 55 people were killed during the course of the riots. 16,291 people were arrested, and estimated $1 billion in property damage was damaged or lost. It was the largest uprising in the United States since the Watts riots in 1965. The 1992 Los Angeles riots, or rebellion, there's a dispute over how to name it, a dispute that I tend to, in the book, carry along with me as I refer to it as riot/rebellion. At any rate, the 1992 Los Angeles Riots Rebellion is born uneasily in the national memory. Earlier riots, such as those in Watts, Detroit, Chicago, or Washington, D.C., produced performances of state and national self-reflection in the form of official government reports, such as the Macomb Report, commissioned after the 1965 Watts riots, or the Kerner Report, issued in 1968, which famously concluded that the nation was becoming, quote, 2 societies, 1 black, 1 white, separate and unequal. A wealth of social science research on class, race, gender, policing, labor, housing, and urban politics emerged from the crises of the 1960s. The response to the 1992 Los Angeles riots was somewhat more ephemeral. A municipal plan to rebuild, managed mostly through public-private partnerships, that evaporated in about 18 months. A municipal commission to study policing during the course of the riots, whose report was dead on arrival due to persistent rumors of the political influence shaping it in advance. Though here at LMU, it played no small role in the founding of the Center for the Study of Los Angeles. Their overall tenor was one of confusion and refusal. One major work of political theory was produced in the wake of the beating of Rodney King and of the riots. And in his contribution to the book, Robert Gooding Williams argues that, quote, it strains credulity to deny, as many conservative and liberal pundits have, that this uprising in Los Angeles was not for many an act of political protest, that blacks' interpretation of their and other Americans' needs might be taken seriously seems to be beyond the pale of intelligibility. Here, Gooding-Williams characterizes the riot as an uprising, arguing that those taking part in it are lodging a political protest against intolerable political conditions, but that this exercise of political agency is unintelligible to the rest of the country. That is, this act was politically unintelligible. So my task today is to interrogate this unintelligibility, or to ask why or how the riots remain somewhat unintelligible to us, and to ask after how that unintelligibility is made. In the book, I argue that this unintelligibility results from a peculiar kind of exclusion. Rather than a simple or absolute exclusion, constitutive exclusion describes the phenomenon of internal exclusion, or those exclusions that occur within a philosophical system or political body. I call this form of exclusion constitutive exclusion. Constitutive exclusions occur when a system of thought or a political body defines itself by excluding some difference which is intolerable to it. This excluded difference nevertheless remains within the body or system that has excluded it, and it continues to do that work of constituting or defining, but under an epistemological block. The book offers an analysis of the concept of constitutive exclusion and the contestation of concrete exclusions. I got nervous and pressed the button. Little preview there for you of all the delicious imagery. Cool. The book offers an analysis of the concept of constitutive exclusion and the contestation of concrete exclusions to better articulate how we know what counts as a political action and who counts as a political agent. It is undertaken for the sake of imagining a future beyond constitutive exclusion. The movement of constitutive exclusion is logically, though not necessarily temporally, twofold. First, a philosophical system or a political body constitutes itself by producing an excluded element or figure that nevertheless remains within it. Second, this remaindered element is covered over, repressed, or disavowed. It's hidden. It's kept out of sight. This constitutively excluded figure is therefore both the condition of possibility and the condition of impossibility of that body that it constitutes. The exclusion of the figure makes the constitution of these philosophical systems and bodies possible, but the fact that the figure remains within that space makes those constitutions impossible, in the sense that the exclusion is never ultimately successful. Such figures are excluded in order to draw the borders of intelligible political agency, but these figures and exclusions remain inside, marking differences that threaten those borders, as well as marking modes of resistance to and paths of flight out of or beyond the delimited space drawn through their exclusion. Constitutive exclusion acts by rendering a contingent difference, such as race, gender, or class, as a necessary one, making it the basis of exclusion from the philosophical system or political body. The excluded difference is pushed outside the boundaries of politics to an extra, or apolitical foundation on which to construct a philosophical system or political body. But this process of making a contingent difference the necessary basis for exclusion, as well as the continued inclusion of these supposedly excluded differences, are covered over, making it seem as though it was necessary to exclude this particular difference all along. In order to make this case, I draw on several different thinkers. I offer an analysis first of Judith Butler's treatment of the contingent outside and her works on frames of intelligibility and how they work to make some lives unlivable or ungrievable. I offer an analysis of the constitutive exclusion of multiplicity or Verschiedenheit in Hegel's Science of Logic, and an analysis of the quasi-transcendental in Derrida's Glas, to argue that constitutive exclusion operates multiply and by means of a retroactive temporality. This means that a philosophical system or political body defines itself as one and as whole through excluding multiple differences. Because these differences remain inside, however, it also ultimately means that the political body that has defined itself against these multiple differences is itself multiple, even though it can't hear, see, recognize, or grasp this, and it persists in its fantasy of unity and oneness. And it also means that the making of a contingent difference into a necessary one for exclusion is done retroactively, or done backwards, though we act as if it proceeds in a normal chronological sense. These as-ifs, these not-seeings, not-knowings, are produced. They are the epistemological function of constitutive exclusion, or they are how constitutive exclusion shapes in advance what or how we know, or who is intelligible and who is unintelligible to us. I then turn to the work of Theodor Adorno to flesh out a method of reading for constitutive exclusion that helps us to think about it with without making the same exclusions that we're trying to critique. Constitutive exclusion thus cuts through ontological, epistemological, and political levels, often marking the border between these levels. This is because the maintenance of that fantasy of a border delimited in intelligible political agency depends upon casting these excluded figures into an a, extra, or pre-political space, despite, or perhaps because of, their persistence within those borders. Because their exclusion secures the fantasy of a fully intelligible political agency on the inside, if those who are excluded within contest their exclusion, those claims are often unintelligible as political claims, and instead appear as diffuse and threatening, as wildness, as madness, or as criminality. Translating the claims that come from these quarters into intelligible political agency is difficult. Frequently, this translation is managed through mere inclusion in the form of a forced or coerced assimilation to already established terms. To do justice to the excluded, to render those claims intelligible as political claims, I argue, instead requires the reconstitution of the political body on new terms. Constitutive exclusion also helps us think about race, class, gender, and sexuality altogether. It can help us better understand how these identity categories constitute each other and how they are reinscribed over time. In this sense, constitutive exclusion is closely related to intersectionality. But whereas intersectionality's dominant metaphor is spatial, and that it names a location where identities meet and redefine each other, constitutive exclusion adds the dimension of time, articulating the historical sedimentation of these identities. It can show us how the histories of multiple exclusions and strategic choices build upon each other, layer by layer, shaping the ground of politics on which we presently stand, but of which we are usually ignorant. And it can help us become sensate to those epistemological blind spots without assimilating or appropriating their critique in advance, and in the hopes of a constitution that no longer relies upon these disavowed exclusions. Okay, in another chapter, I examined two instances of contestation. The first is Antigone, looking really shady at her sister Ismene here, the heroine of the ancient Greek tragedy of the same name, who buried her dead brother against the edict of the king Creon and defended her right to do so. I argue that Antigone was constitutively excluded from the political body of ancient Thebes, and her contestation of her exclusion troubled the boundaries between family and state, and ultimately between masculine and feminine that the state relied on. I then turned to an examination of the choice of Rosa Parks over Claudette Colvin as the figurehead around which to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. Claudette Colvin was a 15-year-old young woman who was arrested about 9 months before Rosa Parks for the same crime, refusing to give up her seat for a white person on the bus. While Joanne Robinson, the leader of the Montgomery Women's Political Council, wanted to mount a boycott campaign around Colvin's arrest, the president of the local chapter of the NAACP, E.D. Nixon, was concerned about her youth, her poverty, and her fierceness. His concerns were solidified when, after her arrest, she began wearing her hair in cornrows and she became pregnant by an older married man. Parks, on the other hand, was a model of feminine middle-class respectability. Though she identified as a black nationalist and was not a proponent of nonviolence, her image is trapped in amber in the national memory as a middle-aged woman tired from a long day at work. What her biographer, Jean Theo Harris, called the Madonna of Montgomery. While both Colvin and Parks are constitutively excluded, their contestation of that exclusion is framed differently in each case. While Parks successfully leveraged other identity categories to translate her contestation into intelligible terms, and I would argue effectively did reconstitute the United States in a certain sense, these other terms, these other identity categories to leverage were not available to Claudette Colvin. And while Colvin's contestation remains somewhat unintelligible, Parks's was reified, and she was rendered less a political subject than a political object. But how does any of this help us to understand the '92 LA riots? My claim here is that we can use constitutive exclusion to interrogate the knot of forces that make up the riots or rebellion in order to understand, if not why the riots remain unintelligible to us as a political contestation of political conditions, at least how this unintelligibility is produced and what significance it bears for us. If a riot is not taken as politically intelligible, if a riot is not read as a legitimate political contestation, then why? What forces condition this reading? How is the riot outside the frame of intelligible political claims? The contestation of constitutive exclusion takes on a different shape here. Rather than insurgence and ambiguity and Antigone's contestation of her exclusion, or strategic straightness and reification in the choice of Parks over Colvin in the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, the 1992 Los Angeles riots or rebellion offers up a complex collective figure. The constitutive exclusion of the rioters puts them outside the terms of intelligible political agency, rendering their contestation of their internal exclusion unintelligible as a political claim, and defining those included as reasonable, law-abiding, and respectful of property. If the riot is the language of the unheard, as the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued in 1967, what went unheard in the 1992 Los Angeles riots or rebellion? And what remained unheard, such that we could continue to frame these uprisings that erupted in the allegedly post-racial era of Obama as, once again, politically unintelligible? It might seem at first counterintuitive that riots are unintelligible as political contestations. After all, riots figure significantly in the history of politics, such as the Stamp Act riots, the Tea Party Rebellion, remember that? Those guys? Yeah. The bread riots that laid the groundwork for the French Revolution. However, in the United States in the 20th century, riots have been framed primarily through race. While there were local geographical and political specificities, prior to the second half of the 20th century, race riots were typically a matter of whites containing, controlling, or destroying people of color or immigrants, or both, who were seen as encroaching on whiteness, whether a white neighborhood, a white woman, or a white job. In Memphis in 1866, in East St. Louis in 1917, in the Red Summer of 1919, especially in Chicago, in Tulsa in 1921, or in Cicero in 1951, or in Turnbull Park in Chicago in 1957. Shifts in the post-war economy, white flight in combination with racist housing restrictions, lack of quality schooling, unemployment, informal racial employment restrictions, and racist policing, or one could say shifts in the consolidation and spatialization of whiteness, which made it no longer necessary to guard the race line with direct force, helped to produce the conditions that that led to the urban riots of the 1960s, riots that seemed increasingly illegible. The case for the unintelligibility of the 92 riots in particular came from the White House, where President George H.W. Bush stated, quote, "What we saw last night and the night before in Los Angeles is not about civil rights. It's not about the great cause of equality that all Americans uphold. It's not a message of protest. It's been the brutality of a mob, pure and simple." Pundits and commentators rushed to agree. An intense effort, both discursive and material, was made to ensure that the language of the riot remained unheard. It is this very structure and process of produced unhearing, produced unseeing, produced not knowing, that the critique of constitutive exclusion is meant to address, and those contestations that remained unheard that it's meant to unbury. In his 2016 book, Riot, Strike, Riot, Joshua Clover writes, quote, "By the second half of the 20th century, race riot summons images of spontaneous black violence. It is only then that the term comes to stand for riot as such. The rhetorical convergence is crude and effective. The purportedly thoughtless and natural character of the riot, lacking reason, organization, and political mediation, is aligned with the racist tradition wherein racialized subjects are figured as natural, animalistic, irrational, immediate." This rhetorical convergence is perhaps nowhere clearer than in the 92 Riots Rebellion. Reporting for the Village Voice in the aftermath of the riots, journalist Peter Kwong called it, quote, "America's first multicultural riot." It was framed, however, by the rhetorical convergence of blackness and riot that Clover describes. This convergence coincides with a white supremacist perceptual framing that marks blackness as contradictorily both invisible and hypervisible, both at once nothing and too much. Lewis Gordon gives us an existential phenomenological analysis of this character of the riot, arguing that it exemplifies the exponentiality of the illicit appearance of black folks in public. In Gordon's account, and the perceptual schema of anti-black society, quote, the effect is exponential, where a black translates into blacks. This exponentiality is the aforementioned hypervisibility constitutive of invisibility. It is why, in spite of the many whites and lighter-skinned Hispanics or Latinos caught on videotape looting during the Los Angeles riot/rebellion, the portrait of the event is black. Thus, despite Peter Kwong's characterization of the riot as a multiracial affair, it is largely perceived as a black riot. This frame of anti-blackness covers over the complexity of the riot, rendering it a black event, as Gordon puts it, or a matter of criminality, or as Bush put it, the brutality of a mob, pure and simple. One way we could understand the effect of this perceptual frame of anti-blackness is through the loosely allied thinkers collected under the banner of Afro-pessimism. Afro-pessimism takes the blackness produced by anti-black racism as the underside of capital, or the underside of the nation, the human, and being itself, the limit point to which all other struggles are positioned, an anti-ontology that flees all systemization or appropriation. The rhetorical function of Afro-pessimism's intervention is an attempt to explode what Jared Sexton argues is the, quote, essentially dividual subject of politics, which reduces every coalition to the interest of the most powerful members. If this were the only model of subjectivity available to us, then Sexton might be right. But my concern is that by claiming to have finally located the singular exclusion that grounds our political and philosophical systems, whether it be blackness or femininity or some other category, we perform again precisely the exclusions that our theorizing is meant to put an end to. That is, too often, theoretical attempts to dislodge exclusion rely on other exclusions to do their work. Work that claims to be anti-foundationalist unconsciously leaves the outlines of foundations in their trail. The critique of constitutive exclusion that I offer in this book instead emphasizes the multiplicity of exclusions and the multiplicity of constitutions. Our political life together, as well as ourselves as political agents, are shaped by a multiplicity of exclusions, and thus a multiplicity of positions from which resistance and subversion may originate. In the larger chapter, I look at 4 different aspects of the riot that are covered over in this anti-black frame. The ambivalence of the holiday video of King's beating, the killing of Latasha Harlins, the multiracial geography of the riot, and the contest over the riot's meaning. I argue that the ambivalence of the holiday video of the beating of Rodney King both confirmed the reality of police brutality against black people. That is, it confirmed that for a larger audience that it was a real, actual thing that happened, and so it was comforting to some people in that sense. But it was also used to acquit the 4 LAPD officers. So this indicates to us that constitutive exclusion does not have a technological solution, or in other words, body cameras will not save us. Next, I look at the killing of Latasha Harlins. She was a 15-year-old black girl who was shot and killed 2 weeks after the beating of Rodney King, and her murderer, Sunjat Du, was sentenced to a suspended sentence, probation, community service, and a fine. While the spectacle of the holiday video, in contrast to the acquittal of the officers, provided an outwardly obvious context for the riots, the death of Harlins, in contrast to Du's sentence, provides an implicit, local, and almost private context for the riots. The death of and it also gestures to the multiracial context of the riots and to the role of gender and sexuality in them. I then turn to the multiracial geography of the riots, describing how Koreans, Korean Americans, and Latino and Latina folks were involved in and impacted by the riot, and how these were covered over by the framing of the riot as black. So during the course of the riot, some 2,300 Korean-owned stores in Southern California were burned, and despite the LAPD's Order 40, which bars police from inquiring after a person's immigration status, more than 1,200 Latinas and Latinas were deported. They were transferred to INS for deportation. No one's entirely sure how many there were. And I then returned to the struggle over the meaning of the riots, a struggle indicated by the very ambivalence in its naming. Riot, rebellion, or uprising. I do not claim that the critique of constitutive exclusion can render the protracted event of the riots fully intelligible. However, it can fill in some of the distance between fully intelligible and beyond the pale of intelligibility. The Los Angeles Riots rebellion is unintelligible as an instance of political protest, and the rioters are unintelligible as political actors as part of their constitutive exclusion. And this constitutive exclusion is negotiated through race, class, and gender. The black citizens of South Central LA were the excluded elements against which the nation defined itself, but who remained within, continuing to figure the borders of belonging, nationhood, and political agency in this country. Since this labor cannot be recognized, they cannot be understood as political agents contesting political conditions. Their unintelligibility renders them and their claims to those on the inside of this hegemony as criminal, wild, and destructive. The rioters, therefore, are part of a mob, or as Lewis Gordon's thesis, the black rioter already is the mob, quote, irrationally destroying his own neighborhood, a rhetorical construction that effectively renders invisible the racial infrastructures that created those neighborhoods. As Gooding Williams argues, the black residents of South Central were treated either as perpetrators or victims of the conditions that fed the riots, depending on the political framing involved. Similarly, Korean Americans were either seen as the victims or the heroes struggling against their black neighbors, while Latinas and Latinos, when they are seen at all, were seen as merely incidental participants, though they made up 40% of those arrested during the course of the riot. All of these perspectives presume the riot as a primarily criminal event, a threatening rupture of the state of nature into the political status quo, but not in itself a political protest. The constitutive exclusion of the rioter does work for those of us on the inside of this hegemonic frame, in that it constitutes the United States as a nation of reasonable, responsible, law-abiding citizens. The bewilderment and the rejection of the destruction of property constructs Americans as respectful and protective of private property, over and above black and Latinx lives. While public opinion data after the 1965 Watts riots and rebellion showed that many of the black residents of Los Angeles believed that the riots would bring attention to and ameliorate the marginalization and oppression faced by black people in LA and the large United States, white respondents agreed that it had raised attention, but the attention they thought it raised was mostly bad. By 1992, the narrative had set in. The rioter interpreted as rioting mainly for fun and profit, gleefully stealing consumer goods and torching the building on the way out. This fun and profit is a phrase that I heard recur, repeated frequently by the BBC in their coverage of the 2011 London riots, from which this photo was taken, which was sparked off by the police killing of a 24-year-old black man in London. That is not to say that looting and arson did not happen. Certainly they did. The fact that rioters specifically targeted Korean and Korean American owned stores, however, indicates that something more than mere irrational destruction is at work. Indeed, the Dews store, Empire Liquors, was one of the first to burn. Moreover, the condemnation and in some cases the shooting of purported looters scavenging for basic necessities during Hurricane Katrina in 2005 should remind us that we cannot count white hegemonic perception as neutral on this score. There may be complex motives at work in looting. In his reporting for the LA Weekly during the riots, LMU's own Ruben Martinez quotes a Chicana mother looting goods, quote, "This is about trying to get something to eat for our kids. Who knows where we're going to get food once everything has been destroyed?" This might be the single most famous image from the LA riots, and notice that he has Huggies in his cart. Indeed, during the curfew period, there were few to no shops left or open in which to buy food, diapers, or baby formula, and many residents lacked either cars or the gas to put in them. Beyond other motives for looting, we might pay closer attention to the political significance of looting itself, especially looting from stores whose owners are viewed as exploitative, racist, or profiting from the maintenance of intense segregation. After the initial riots in Ferguson, Missouri, in response to the police murder of black teenager Michael Brown, DeAndre Smith defended looting as a political tactic in relation to specific conditions of exploitation in the St. Louis area. Sure. And here's what he had to say.
This was DeAndre Smith. And this is exactly what's supposed to happen when an injustice is happening in your community. When you have kids getting killed for nothing. When they out here minding their business doing things, you can lock them up. You can teach them. You can mold them. At the same time, you ain't got to kill him. He ain't got no gun in his hands. Why you killing him? You say Trayvon had a hoodie on. You didn't know what was going on with him. He didn't have no hoodie on. His hands was up when you shot him. So what's your excuse? I was here. So, I was here. I was out here. That's all I can say. I was out here with the community. That's all I can say. I was out here standing side by side with the community. I mean, I don't think it's over, honestly. I think they just got a taste of what fighting back means. I think they got a taste of,
In St. Louis.
In St. Louis, the last state to abolish slavery. Do they think they still have power over certain things? I believe so, because they're doing stuff like this and getting away with it. People ain't saying nothing. They're not doing nothing across the country. They not going for it here. St. Louis ain't going for it. This is how they eat here. This is how they receive money. Businesses, the taxes, police stopping people, giving them tickets, taking them to court, locking them up. That's how they make money in St. Louis, right? Traffic, everything is all about money in St. Louis, right? So when you stop their flow of income, when you stop their whole, everything, their business, what they organize, they have certain things in a certain way, right? Secret society type of deal, right? We're gonna eat and you guys are gonna starve. Gentrification, put you in a certain neighborhood by yourself and see if you can starve in a proper way. It's not gonna happen, not in St. Louis.
Indeed, the Justice Department report on policing in Ferguson, released the following spring as a result of the pressure exerted by the riots, confirmed the very conditions that Smith describes here. It found a widespread abuse of police authority and court practices designed to extract money from its black residents as a strategy for funding municipal government. Ta-Nehisi Coates took this lesson from the Department of Justice report. Quote, "White supremacy is the technology patented in this enlightened era to ensure that what is yours inevitably becomes mine." Under these conditions, looting cannot be simply understood as an irrational criminal behavior or fun and profit. Indeed, these perspectives at the very least maintain a strict distinction between political protest and private property, keeping us from asking after the very political conditions of ownership. At best, it keeps us from pursuing a deeper analysis of the racial technologies of profit-making. At worst, it maintains the notion that property is more important than the lives and personhood of black citizens. As is the case in Ferguson, the rejection of the possibility of seeing looting in the Los Angeles riots or rebellion in political terms serves to maintain its unintelligibility as a contestation of constitutive exclusion, and thus maintains the hegemonic white supremacist definitions of the political. Ultimately, the immediate rejection of the possibility that the 92 Los Angeles riots or rebellions could be a political response to political conditions served to reinforce the hegemonic construction of politics and of political agency in the United States, and rendered the riots unintelligible as a contestation of exclusion. This unintelligibility covers over layers of complex operations of exclusion at work in the riots. It's geography, it's gender and sexuality, it's class, it's multiraciality. This unintelligibility was never necessary, and it is not now necessary, just as the anti-blackness that frames the unintelligibility of the riots is not necessary, despite its function in ensuring that riots remain the language of the unheard. Certainly, I think we can say that the role of police in producing political unintelligibility is decisive, shifting riots from a political protest to a matter of security, rendering protesters simply criminal or just threats to public safety, or under the conditions of the increased militarization of policing, terrorists, further serves to render political protest unintelligible as political, and to exclude those who have engaged in it in such a way that our terms of politics and political agency are increasingly impoverished. When the encampments of the Occupy movement in Zuccotti Park, Chicago, Oakland, Los Angeles, or Davis, and many other places around the country were described as threats to public health, or when police in these cities expressed concerns with the drug use, theft, and sexual assault that they hoped to produce by treating the encampments as free zones, directing what they saw as potential criminals to the encampments, and then refusing calls from those inside for protection. These spaces were effectively depoliticized, and the police response was predetermined. When the Baltimore Police Department's Media Relations Unit posted public notice in advance of planned protests against the killing of Freddie Gray in April 2016, that criminal gangs in Baltimore had declared a truce in order to unify their forces against the Baltimore PD, this had the effect of depoliticizing the protests in advance, rendering it merely a security matter. This was bunk. This never happened. Where marginalized and oppressed people fight back against intolerable political conditions in the streets and are rendered merely thugs, criminals, or terrorists, and not as political agents making a political critique of intolerable political conditions, constitutive exclusion is at work. The political unintelligibility of the riot, especially that produced by the police and through the frame of anti-blackness, may be the lasting legacy of the '92 Los Angeles riots rebellion. Thank you.
So we have approximately 20 minutes dedicated for questions. Does anybody want to start us off?
Hi. So when you were saying that like the riots are like the spoken words of like people that feel that they've been like misheard and misrepresented, what are your personal opinions on like the media coverage and like also like how like the president has reacted from the differences between the 1992 riots in LA versus like what's been happening like in Charleston right now, seeing how like they're both riots but they're like on like completely like different like issues from like completely different voices?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a little bit difficult to compare the two, to make comparisons across like time and space and geography, but I will give it a shot. I think that, there's a contestation over the framing of what happened in Charleston, right? Like, there was an active disagreement about what was going on there. Obviously, it was a tragedy. A person was killed totally senselessly. But it's interesting that it seemed to me that what was happening in the media was people framing this initially the night before with the Tiki Torch March, like, ooh, this is weird and kind of disturbing. And then the next day, the framing was much more like, whoa, this is actually very, very serious. It's interesting to me that there was a pushback against the framing of its seriousness, that we should take white supremacist, fascist terrorism seriously as a thing that's actually happening in the world, that there was a pushback against our understanding of that event in that way from the White House itself, right? There's just good guys and bad guys on both sides, we're just trying to get along and work it out. And yeah, that's not what happened in '92. It's not what happened in Ferguson or in Baltimore. Those events, those riots were referred to as criminal, and the rioters were called thugs by whoever was in the White House at the time, whether it be George H.W. Bush or Barack Obama, who referred to the people in Baltimore during the riot as thugs.
First of all, thank you for your research. This was a great presentation. This is a very loaded question, but what should we do about the framing of uprisings and rebellions? What should we do for our own safety? Obviously, I'm a white person, and I probably wouldn't be labeled as a thug or somebody else who's protesting the same exact thing. But what is there to do?
That's That's a really great question, thank you. I would say that the best thing that you can do is to get involved in local organizations and see where they can use you and how, right? There are a lot of fantastic organizations being led by people of color and queer youth of color around town, and they need folks to sort of help them out. So I think that some of the best ways that you can use the skills and the tools that you have is to see what they need, right? I also think that something that we need right now is good journalism. So we need people who are trained in and unafraid of talking to strangers, as many strangers as possible, going to people and getting involved in uncomfortable situations, just to ask questions, to seek out the truth wherever it is. I think that that's super important work as well. Yeah.
So my question was really just a direct follow-up on that, and you've walked right in the direction I was going to ask the question, which is, what advice would you give to journalists in covering these issues? If you think about the practice of journalism, the standards they have to adhere to, and also, you know, what they're trying to accomplish, how would you advise them to cover these issues differently than they have been?
That's a great question. I think that being aware of the framing is important. Being aware that we are frequently, hopefully, they should read my book as well. Being aware that our perceptions are frequently framed by forces that we are unaware of, and we can only become aware of them and to control them and push back against them by learning more about them. So learning more about them would be one way to help sort of check any framing that might be entering into the story. I think that citizen journalism certainly has a role to play here. Everybody's got a phone, everybody's got a video recorder, everybody's got, you know, a means of recording people's voices. And I think that most importantly, it's about paying attention to what people are saying on the street there, rather than what happens in so much of reporting, especially when it filters up into political reporting. Who said what, who's up, who's down, who wins the day, right? That's not helpful, because that kind of snap response just seems to perpetuate the frame rather than to push back against it and challenge it, and allow us to see folks on the ground giving incredibly rich and politically astute descriptions of their own political conditions.
I was just wondering if you could elaborate on your comment regarding technology use and body cams within police enforcement, and I was just wondering, or I was just curious as to what you thought were some possible solutions in the future, just in terms of enlightening and people of the situation, or getting the truth from, you know, different riots and stuff like that. So I just wonder what you thought were.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think that one of the biggest lessons of the holiday video, one reason that I think that the 92 riots have so much to teach us, but have been sort of left behind in this way that's really unfortunate, is that the holiday video was used both to show people around the country that police brutality and police violence happens, but the same video was used to acquit those 4 officers of any wrongdoing, right? So there's a way that how we're seeing things is not really related to the thing that we're seeing, right? The thing that we're watching, or they're slightly distinct. We can, you know, the video was framed during the trial as Rodney King being entirely responsible for his own beating. That was the argument that acquitted those 4 officers. So that tells me that body cameras are not really necessarily going to be an effective solution. We need a political solution to political problems. A technological solution technology is cool, and you know, we can watch pretty pictures and see video of folks on the street, and you know, I'm not standing here being a Luddite and railing against it. But it's a tool, and tools are used for purposes, right? They aren't ends in themselves. They're means towards other ends. And so we have to be careful about how we're understanding what we're seeing, and what frames are motivating
That was really good.
Oh, thanks. So happy you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had any insight about how the model of constitutive exclusion can inform conversation with sort of the very uninformed or complacent members of the we society.
Ooh. That's so hard. Because the form that this disavowal, that we rely on people, that we think we exclude or we hate, we actually need them near us in order to continue defining ourselves against them. It's this weird paradox that constitutive exclusion is meant to sort of structure. That disavowal move is really, really strong, and the need to believe that we are all like one people and one nation and we're all the same in some fundamental way is very, very strong. Wherever you can find it, I guess. I don't really have an answer. Sort of, it helped in my own family having discussions about the history of my family's immigration to this country and the different legal terms and legal structures that were operative during those times, right? So for a while, it was really a big thing in my family for folks to be like, our Irish ancestors came here legally. And it's like, well, there was no law against them doing that. So some of them didn't come here legally, by the way. They were stowaways or whatever. So pointing to some sort of familiar instances, some instances that are more home for folks might help with that, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, that was great and very poignant to the political situation today. I guess psychologically speaking, we all have implicit bias. And so where, given that implicit bias, kind of what's the validity for activists to choose to turn things from an unintelligible to an intelligible narrative? I think especially given the hegemonic white supremacy that we kind of operate in today, in order to make their message more digestible to the masses.
Yeah, that's a really important question. So I have a chapter on Antigone on the one hand, and then the choice of Rosa Parks instead of Claudette Colvin, around whom to organize the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. And I'm really careful in that chapter to say, look, it was a strategy, it was a very canny political strategy, and they did the thing, man. You can't fault them for doing the thing. It was a successful strategy. It took more than a year. It took an intense material effort, but it worked, right? So one of the lessons, I think, of the choice of Parks over Colvin is, A, the strategies work, but B, what do we leave behind? What's left out of the picture? Who's harder to hear as a result of that strategic choice, right? So I think keeping that in mind, and the thing is that you're never going to be totally successful. You're always going to mess up, but don't be scared of messing up, right? We need to be kinder to each other in order to allow ourselves to mess up and get better. Yeah.
One more question.
In say protest actions and stuff that don't have a narrative of racial conflict necessarily mapped onto them, say the anti-globalization protests in the 90s or stuff, what is the effect of that then on how their intelligibility, or how does that sort of shape the discourse around them?
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I think I would have to look into, especially Seattle, more closely. But I know for a fact that there were indigenous activists at the Seattle protests in specific who were like, no, there is a racial frame operating here. It's a colonial racial frame, so it's operating a little bit differently than the one that Joshua Clover or Lou Gordon is talking about. Yeah, that's complicated, dude. I have to think about that a little while. Especially given that sometimes the overwhelming frame of these sorts of protests and movements is that it's protest tourism on behalf of white elites who claim to be speaking for third world people who never seem to be present at the protest. I don't know if that's the case. Like I said, I would have to look much more deeply into it, but I think that's a really interesting difference from the model that I've been discussing today. Yeah.
Okay, unless there are any other burning questions, I wanted to once again thank Dr. Kramer. Also, thank you to Dr. Diltz for today's introduction. Thank you, Dr. Diltz.
Yeah.
Also, and thank you to my fellow library outreach teammates, Carol Raby and John Jackson and Allie. Thank you very much. We do have plenty of time for mingling, so there's plenty of food, there's plenty of drinks still around. Don't forget, if you fill out this feedback form and provide your email address, and if you could please submit it into that plastic box on the counter, you would be entered into that raffle for the $100 Amazon gift card. And I did want to note that faculty pub night happens once a month, so our next faculty pub night is on November 14th. That's going to be featuring Dr. Gregory Ruzin for the School of Film and Television. He's going to be talking about the Magic Chair Project. That's a project that makes an attempt to collect the stories of people with disabilities, in case you're interested. That'll be here in the same room. Okay, so again, thank you, everybody.
I'm not really sure if it's going to come up, but philosophy stuff is going to be flying at you. Then we're going to talk about like this thing that happened right here. Right here.
Great presentation. Thank you. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Wiping your brow. Oh my God. Just trying to suppress the
Oh.
Eventually, when I get around to figuring out how to address my question.
It's like, no.
Right, I want to help you figure out.
Yeah, I was going to say, I would pose that.
Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah.
And we have a digital library copyright.
Okay.
Stuff.
Okay.
So